Hola a todos y bienvenidos al MOOC, Curso Básico de Lengua y Cultura Españolas, Nivel 2. Welcome to the Basic Spanish Language and Culture course, Level 2. Soy Vijaya Venkatraman, soy tu profesor de español para este curso online. En este video vamos a hablar de la literatura del siglo de oro y de uno de los escritores españoles más reconocidos en el mundo, Miguel de Cervantes y su obra Don Quijote, conocido como El Quijote. In this video, you will learn about the golden age of Spanish literature and Miguel de Cervantes, one of Spain's best-known writers, and his magnum opus Don Quixote. What exactly is the golden age of Spanish literature? The Spanish golden age, as it is known Siglo de Oro in Spanish, was a period of high artistic activity and achievement that lasted from about 1580 to 1680. It began with the political unification of Spain under the Catholic kings Ferdinand and Isabel, known as Los Reyes Católicos, and during this period, El Greco and Velázquez, the most famous Spanish painters, painted their masterpieces, and Cervantes wrote his famous satirical novel Don Quixote. Theatre also enjoyed a golden age in acting and playwriting. Its literature is characterized by patriotic and religious fervor, heightened realism, and a new interest in earlier epics and ballads. Now we will talk about the important genres and works of the golden age. As I've said before, theatre, poetry, and the novel flourished during this period, and the Baroque style was predominant also. During the Spanish Baroque, authors suffered from a deep pessimism at the utter failure of the Renaissance ideals, which had promised happiness and perfection. Instead, they got a world riddled with wars, sickness, and deep economic and political problems. Their works were full of symbolism and allegories. Avoidance of reality on the one hand and critique of reality were the two opposing reactions in this period. Let us talk about the theatre of the Golden Age. Theatrical performances at this time took place in open sites, squares, or fixed corrals, which were known as the Los Corrales. They began around 2 in the afternoon and lasted until dusk. In general, there were no seats, and spectators had to remain standing throughout the performance. The nobility occupied balconies and windows of houses that surrounded the square or led to the corral, and ladies attended the spectacle with their faces covered with masks or obscured behind lattice windows. The function began with a performance on the guitar, followed by songs accompanied with diverse instruments, and the praise of the work came soon, followed by an explanation of the work and a synthesis of its main plot. The main comedy or work then started, and in the interval, dances were executed or entremeses represented. The stage was nothing but a simple platform and the decoration a curtain. The changes of a scene were announced by one of the actors. The poet wrote the comedy, paid to the director, to whom he yielded all the rights of the work, represented or printed, and gave him the right to modify the text. The work lasted 3 or 4 days in the billboard, or with exceptions, 15 days for a successful comedy. The most famous works of this period are the philosophical drama Life is a Dream by Calderón de la Barca, the historical play Fuente Ovejuna by Lope de Vega, and The Trickster of Seville about the legendary lover Don Juan by Tirso de Molina. There were also great comedies, religious dramas, farces, and tragedies by these and other playwrights. The three forms that of the Golden Age theatre are the comedia, the autosacramental, and the entremés. Autosacramentales are one-act religious allegories, and entremeses are the one-act farces originally performed between the acts of full-length comedias. Comedias were 3-act dramas written in verse, which mixed comic and serious elements in complex plots and often emphasized intrigue, disguises, music, and swordplay. Now we'll talk about the important playwrights. Felix Lope de Vega y Carpio who was born in 1562 and died in 1635, his reputation in the world of Spanish literature is second only to that of Miguel de Cervantes, while the sheer volume of his literary output is unequaled, making him one of the most prolific authors in the history of Spanish literature. He was nicknamed the Phoenix of Wits and Monster of Nature. He renewed Spanish theatre at a time when it was going to become a mass theatre. He defined its key characteristics and along with Pedro Calderón de la Barca and Tirso de Molina, took Spanish Baroque theatre to its greatest heights. Now, if we look at Arte Nuevo de Hacer Comedias in 1609, he established in this work the three-act commedia as the definitive form, ignoring the precepts of the prevailing school of his contemporaries. This was his artistic manifesto, which was published in 1609, and the justification of his style, which broke the classical unities of place, time, and action. He advocated the free choice of themes, the mixing of the tragic and the comic, use of language as required by characters, simple or elevated, and the use of verse for writing theatre. Then we talk about Tirso de Molina, who was a Spanish Baroque dramatist. He was a poet and also a Roman Catholic monk. He is primarily known for The Trickster of Sevilla and The Stone Guest, the play from which the popular character of Don Juan emerges. His work is also of particular significance due to the abundance of female protagonists as well as the exploration of sexual issues. Though he was not as successful as Lope de Vega, he exceeds Lope in massive intellectual power and in artistic self-restraint, and he exceeds Calderón in humor, in creative faculty, and in dramatic intuition. Pedro Calderón de la Barca, born in 1600 and died in 1681, he was a poet, writer, and knight of the Order of Santiago, and he is one of the most distinguished Baroque writers of the Spanish Golden Age. He developed Lope's ideas further, and his work being regarded as the culmination of the Spanish Baroque. His strength lay in his capacity for poetic beauty, dramatic structure, and philosophical depth. Life is a Dream, published in 1636, is his best known work, and it's a philosophical allegory regarding the human situation and the mysteries of life. The play's central themes are the conflict between free will and fate, as well as restoring one's honor. Now we will talk about poetry and the two strands of Conceptismo and Culteranismo, which were associated with the two most important poets, Luis de Góngora on one hand and Francisco de Quevedo on the other hand. They were enemies, bitterly so, and composed many bitter and funny satirical pieces attacking each other. Góngora's lyric collection consists of sonnets, odes, ballads, songs for the guitar, and of some larger poems as well. And Culteranismo is a stylistic movement of the Baroque period, which is also commonly referred to as Gongorismo after Luis de Góngora. It is characterized by an ornamental, ostentatious vocabulary and a message that is complicated by heavy use of metaphors and complex syntactical order. On the other hand, Conceptismo is characterized by a rapid rhythm, directness, simple vocabulary, witty metaphors, and wordplay. And in this style, multiple meanings are conveyed in a very concise manner, and conceptual intricacies are emphasized over elaborate vocabulary. It is associated with the poetry of Quevedo, as I mentioned earlier, who was one of the most prominent poets of the age. His poetic works range from satirical and mythological subjects to love poetry and philosophical pieces. Now we will talk about the novel of the Spanish Golden Age, and we will talk about Baltasar Gracian, who was born in 1601 and died in 1658. His most important work is the Criticón, and with it the Spanish novel resolved its concepts and abstractions, and the idea prevails over the concrete figure, and it is basically a philosophical novel written in the form of an allegory of the human life. In Gracian's work, the world is seen as a hostile space full of deceit and illusion, triumphing over virtue and truth, where man is a self interested and malicious being. Many of his books are manuals of behavior that allow the reader to succeed gracefully in spite of the maliciousness of his fellow men. Now we will mention Maria de Sayas and Sotomayor, who is considered an important novelist of the century, and her loving and exemplary tales appeared in 1637, which is a collection of 10 stories in which the erotic thematic creates conflicting and surprising situations. The female characters in her stories were used as vehicles to enlighten readers about the plight of women in Spanish society. Now we come to one of the most popular literary genres in Spain, which were the chivalric romance or libros de caballería, as they are known in Spanish. They were fantastic stories about marvel-filled adventures, often a chivalric knight portrayed as having heroic qualities and who goes on a quest to vanquish his enemies to create a better world. These works were full of battles, action, combats, which the heroes undertook as ideal citizens and brave, faithful, and good men who would take to arms to protect their country and the women. One of the reasons for their popularity was the portrayal of the chivalric ethos of loyalty to the king and religion, and its militaristic fervor and its Christian undertone found ready resonance in Spain. Then we come to the pastoral romance, which was launched as a vogue by Jorge Montemayor in The Seven Books of Diana, published in 1559, which were stories about the bucolic and the peaceful life of shepherds, shepherdesses, and their experiences in love. Extremely popular, they were also considered a residual form of the Renaissance, with great attention to rich and sensuous details and an elevated verbal style. The last form of the novel, the genre that we come to, is the picaresque novel, which comes from the word picaresca, from picaro, which means a rogue or a rascal, and it is a genre of prose fiction which became popular in that time. It depicts the adventure of a roguish but appealing hero, usually of the low social class, who lives by his wits in a corrupt society. Picaresque novels typically adopt a realistic style. There are often some elements of comedy and satire. Their influence extends to the 20th century novel, dramas, and films, such as those featuring the anti-hero. The most important picaresque novel is The Life of Lazarillo de Tormes and of his fortunes and adversities, which was published in 1554. It is a Spanish novella which was published anonymously, possibly because of its anti-clerical content. Lazarillo de Tormes is considered the founding of the picaresque novel, and it was banned by the Spanish crown and included in the index of forbidden books by the Spanish Inquisition. The primary objections to Lazarillo had to do with its vivid and realistic descriptions of the world of the pauper and the petty thief. The worm's eye view of society contrasted sharply with the more conventional literary focus on superhuman exploits recounted in chivalric romances. Other examples of picaresque novels which became very well known are El Buscón, translated as Paul the Sharper or the Scavenger and the Swindler, which was written by Francisco de Quevedo. It was written around 1604, although the exact date of its completion is not known, and only published in 1626. It is presented in the first person singular and chronicles the adventure of Don Pablos, a buscón or a swindler. He sets out in his life with two aims: to learn virtue and to become a caballero, and he fails miserably in both. El Buscón has been considered a profound satire on Spanish life, but also as a literary exercise for Quevedo, in that he was able to utilize word play and verbal flourishes and show his skill as a literary caricaturist. Now we come to Miguel de Cervantes, who lived between 1547 and 1616 and is best known for his novel Don Quixote, a work often cited as both the first modern novel and one of the pinnacles of world literature. Much of Cervantes' life was spent in poverty and obscurity, while the bulk of his surviving work was produced in the 3 years preceding his death, when he was supported by the Count of Lemos and did not have to work. Despite this, his influence and literary contribution are reflected by the fact that Spanish is often referred to as the language of Cervantes. Cervantes fought in the Battle of Lepanto in 1571 and lost the use of his left hand. He was captured by the Berbers and was in captivity in Algiers for 5 years between 1580 and 1585. In 1587, Cervantes was appointed as a government purchasing agent and then became a tax collector in 1592. He was briefly jailed several times for irregularities that he had committed, but he was quickly released too. He applied several times for positions in Spanish America, but they were rejected. Cervantes wrote plays, poetry, short novellas, picaresque novels, pastoral romance, but none of them were successful. In 1605, he published the first book of Don Quixote, which is a founding work of Western literature. It is often labeled as the first modern novel and one of the greatest works ever written. Don Quixote is also one of the most translated books in the world. The plot revolves around the adventures of a member of the lowest nobility, an hidalgo as they were called, from an area of the La Mancha, and whose name was Alonso Quijano. Now, Alonso Quijano reads so many chivalry novels that he either loses or pretends to have lost his mind in order to become a knight errant. That is, he wants to become a caballero andante, to revive chivalry and to serve his nation. And he takes the name as Don Quixote de la Mancha, spelt Quixote. He recruits a simple farmer, Sancho Panza, as his squire, who often employs a unique, earthy wit in dealing with Don Quixote's rhetorical monologues on knighthood, already considered old-fashioned at that time and representing the most ordinary realism in contrast to his master's idealism. Cervantes set out to challenge a form of literature that had been the favorite for more than a century, that is, the chivalry novels that we have talked about earlier, and he explicitly stated that his purpose was to undermine the vain and empty chivalry romance. His portrayal of real life and use of everyday speech in a literary context was considered very innovative and proved instantly popular. The two parts of Don Quixote are different in focus, but similar in their clarity of prose and realism. The first was more comic and had greater popular appeal. The second is often considered more sophisticated and complex, with a greater depth of characterization and philosophical insight. What continues to intrigue and charm readers and critics even today is the multiple layers of meanings that can be uncovered in the novel through the 4 centuries of its life. Even today, writers, readers, and critics try to make sense of the meaning behind the text, its characters, and the author's life. Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, as we mentioned earlier, were the two main characters in the novel, and they are characterized as opposites. What Don Quixote sees is not what is there in reality, but perception determines his action. His actions were predetermined since he had promised Sancho Panza adventure and knightly glory and tribute. Don Quixote upholds the knightly tradition, however mistakenly, by fighting in honor of Dulcinea, his lady. On the other hand, Sancho Panza does not ever see what Don Quixote sees, but goes along with him with the hopes of being deemed as a knight by Don Quixote and being promised the gift of an island by Don Quixote as well. Don Quixote's sidekick is his squire Sancho Panza, who is also a contrast in appearance. Sancho Panza is a short, pot-bellied peasant whose appetite, common sense, and vulgar wit serve as a foil to the idealism of his master. He is notable for his many pertinent proverbs. The relationship between Don Quixote and Sancho Panza is a really important one because their friendship is depicted across social class lines in Spain during the 17th century, where strict social orders were in place. The relationship between Don Quixote and Sancho Panza is a really important one because their friendship is depicted across social class lines in Spain during the 17th century, where strict social hierarchies were in place. The relationship between Don Quixote and Sancho Panza allowed Sancho Panza to bring out the realism of Don Quixote through his personality because he is a realist. Sancho is good for Don Quixote because he guides him along their journey, though they are complete opposites. Now we will briefly refer to one episode of the novel, which is Don Quixote rides his steed Rocinante and Sancho Panza rides a donkey until Don Quixote can win him a proper horse for Sancho after defeating an adversarial knight. So he says, as chapter 8 begins, which is known as the chapter of the windmills, Don Quixote and Sancho Panza come upon the site of windmills. Don Quixote sees giants for windmills and starts attacking them, even after Sancho Panza warns him not to mistake the windmills for anything but windmills. One windmill catches the wind and knocks down Don Quixote.
Mira, Sancho, contempla lo que tenemos ahí delante. La fortuna va guiando nuestras cosas mejor aún de lo que deseáramos, porque ves allí, amigo, más de 30 desaforados gigantes. Ahora mismo pienso entrar en batalla con ellos y quitarles las vidas para enriquecernos con sus despojos y arrebatarles sus reinos, si es que poseen alguno.
Muy bien, señor, muy bien. ¿Y a qué gigante se refiere?
¿Eh? Aquellos que ves allí.
¿Allí?
Aquellos cuya soberbia es mayor aún que su estatura y que agitan los cielos levantando una tempestad de viento y furor. Aunque mováis más de 100 brazos, os rendiré mi espada. Mira, cuán largos tienen los brazos. Algunos los tienen de más de 2 leguas. Esta es buena batalla, Sancho. Gran servicio a Dios es quitar la mala simiente de la faz de la tierra. Bruciferno. Carmadón. Gabón el negro. Dalialán. Ternuronte el malo. Anfeón. Carpatracio. Pronastor el orgulloso.
¡Señor! ¡No son gigantes! ¡Y lo que parecen brazos son las aspas! ¡Señor!
¡Calla, Sancho! Y prepara Rocinante. ¡Apresúrate, amigo!
Señor, son molinos.
Si tienes miedo, quédate y ponte en oración.
No es miedo, señor. Verá, lo que yo digo...
voy a entrar con ellos en fiera y desigual batalla.
Preste atención, vuestra merced. Con todos mis respetos, son solo molinos que mueve el viento, señor. Son molinos.
Son gigantes. Socorredme, señora mía, Dulcinea. ¡Non fuyades, cobardes y viles criaturas! ¡Que un solo caballero es quien os acomete!
Señor, señor, ya le dije que mirase bien lo que hacía, pero vuestra merced no quiso escucharme. Levántese. Levántese.
Calla, Sancho, calla. ¿Sabes lo que pienso?
¿Qué?
Que el malvado Frestón ha intervenido en esto. ¡Quedas avisado, Frestón! De nada han de valer tus malas artes contra la bondad de mi espada.
As you can see, this novel is extremely comic in character, especially the first part, and which becomes serious and acquires different layers in the second part, which also reflects on and which was published posthumously after Cervantes died. Now we come to the end of this video, and in this video we'll briefly summarize what you have learnt. You have learnt about the Spanish Golden Age literature, that is the 16th and 17th centuries, and we've talked about the main literary genres of the period, that is the theatre, the poetry, the novel, and the important writers of the period. We've also talked about Cervantes and his masterpiece Don Quixote, which is considered a classical novel and one of the most important novels in Western literature. I would like to end this video with some suggestions for further readings. You can read Don Quixote. It is a very big book, but it is also an extremely entertaining and satisfying book to read. And you can read the modern translation into English by Edith Grossman if you want to read in English. And if you want to try it in Spanish, you can read the modern Spanish version by Andrés Rapiello, which is called El Ingenioso Hidalgo Don Quijote de la Mancha, or you could even read it in Hindi in a translation which has been done by Professor Vibha Maurya. Thank you very much for your attention.